Good evening and welcome to Capital Connection, where we join the dots to give you the big picture for business in Africa. I am Fifi Peters. On the agenda today, our panel of experts discuss Africa's timber trade and whether plunder or sustainability is the order of the day. In our Youth Africa segment, we feature 23-year-old Kenyan entrepreneur June Suoria. Raised in a Nairobi slum, she escaped poverty through the launch of an internet business to help small businesses increase their profile and online sales. But first, emerging market currencies have been hit hard by Turkey's currency crisis. South Africa's rand is no exception. When the world's 20th most traded currency takes a knock, so does the rand-pegged currencies of Lesotho, Namibia and Swaziland. Joining me in a studio to discuss this further is FNB's Wayne McCurry. Wayne, thanks so much for your time as always. I mean, what impact does the rand's volatility have on the rest of the region?
Well, look, obviously the rand is the main currency in Southern Africa, and it's, as you said, one of the world's most traded emerging market currencies. So whenever it's weakened, it's never ever good news other than for exporters. Sure. Of course, exporters love a weaker rand, but for you and me, it means higher petrol price, higher inflation, and probably at the end of the day, higher interest rates as well in this region.
Right. And I suppose for our brothers and sisters on the rest of the continent, a weaker rand for the likes of Swaziland, Lesotho, Namibia, what does it mean for them? Very much
so. I mean, look, at the end of the day, although we would very much like it to be different, Africa as a whole is a commodity exporting country.
Sure.
And all of this is all really one system. They're all tied together. A weaker rand normally implies falling commodity prices, and we've seen the copper price fall quite recently. Only the oil price is still holding up. So this is part of, I suppose you could call it a change in cycle globally. It's not just Turkey.
Sure. The
interest rate cycle is changing globally. Maybe even the global growth rate cycle is slowing down a little bit. And all of these factors, unfortunately, are negative for Africa, and in particular negative for the rand. And then of course you throw in Donald Trump and Turkey, none of this helps.
And especially for countries, not so much us, but on the rest of the continent, your likes of Ghana that have borrowed quite heavily in dollars. Rising interest rates, not a good thing for their economies.
And of course, I mean, maybe South Africa is in a reasonably good position because our non-rand debt is actually quite low. But other countries, as you mentioned, have got significant dollar debt. And of course, when your domestic currency weakens, you struggle to repay that debt in dollars. And that's what's happened to emerging markets, quite frankly, forever. It's not new. I mean, we've seen many crises, South American over the last 2 or 3 or 4 decades, Mexico, the eastern countries. We've seen many crises where emerging markets take on excess dollar debt or euro debt, whatever, and then when the currency collapses, when the economy turns down, they simply can't pay it. So it's the so-called twin deficit, if you like to call it that. Your government's running a deficit, in other words, they're spending more than they're earning in taxes, and the country's running a deficit where you import more than you export. And there you rely on foreign currency.
I mean, we've seen crises before, as you do say. How probable is it that what's happening in Turkey now, that has seen a blowout in emerging market currencies like our own, how probable is it that this is the start of the next emerging market crisis?
Look, it's very difficult to predict that. I personally don't think so, because I don't think there's that much excess in the system, number one. Number two, the rand certainly wasn't overvalued at the start, whereas the previous crisis, 2008, the rand was actually quite expensive before the start of the crisis. But everything at the end of the day for emerging markets boils down to Chinese growth rate. Now, it is slowing, but it is still growing. So the growth rate is slowing down. So as long as China's growth holds, as long as world economic growth holds, we should not see a major crisis in emerging markets. Because to get a true crisis, you need global growth to slow down significantly. And I cannot see that. Because that's what happened in 2002 when we had a proper crisis, 1998 and 2008. It's actually, we are appendages of the global economy. So I don't think we could suffer a crisis on our own. We could have tough times like we're having now, but you truly need the world growth to slow down to get a full-blown emerging market crisis.
We'll leave it there. Thanks so much
Sure.
for your time. And that's where we leave it with FNB's Wayne McCurry. Joining us from Harare is the Institute for Security Studies senior researcher Derek Matyszak. Derek, thanks so much for your time. Now, many would say that media interest may be ebbing in Zimbabwe now, but the economy essentially remains on life support. What are the economic prospects post the Zimbabwe elections?
Well, as you say, all eyes are at the moment on the electoral petition, the petition before the Constitutional Court. So it may be that people are waiting to see the outcome of that court case. That will then draw a line under the elections, and the investors will then, on the basis of that court case, probably look to see where to go from here. However, having said that, the outcome of the court case is more or less a foregone conclusion. So the investors are assessing the situation after the post-election violence, assessing the likelihood of a more open Zimbabwe after the elections. And of course, those perceptions have taken a heavy knock due to that post-election violence.
And Derek, I'm interested, what is your view of what the outcome of the court case will be, and what informs your point that you make that outcome is already a foregone conclusion?
Well, internationally, I think there have only been about 4 petitions challenging a presidential election that have ever succeeded. We know recently one of those was in Kenya. But it's a very high hurdle and a very high bar that petitioners have to get over to succeed in an election petition. And the judiciary in Zimbabwe is well known for siding with the executive. So it's very, very unlikely that Nelson Chamisa will get a positive outcome from this court case. Matters will all be decided by the 24th of this month. So we see how the land lies then. But I don't think that the court will give a full judgment. They will simply give a ruling on the 24th, or maybe a day earlier than that, and we'll have to wait quite some time before we get a ruling on this court case.
Well, Derek, thanks so much for your time. We leave it there, and we await to see indeed how the court rules on the manner of the opposition challenging the election results. Time for our Youth Africa segment now, and June Siowiya has a slew of awards for her entrepreneurship, including being named in the top 100 of Africa's brightest young minds. Capital Connection correspondent Anazi Azoti caught up with her earlier. Let's take a look.
So June, you come from a very humble background in Kenya. How has that helped you become the person that you are today?
Okay, I was born and raised in a semi-slum area in Kenya, Nairobi, and it's that place where dreams are lost because it's near a dump site where the biggest dump site in Kenya is. And just growing up, the things that I went through, it made me a tough person, you know. So I wanted to change that situation. I wanted to change the narrative that when you come from a particular place, even if you're young, you know, you can't be anything bigger than that, you know. So that inspiration to just impact even the people who live in that area, to know that we can actually change this, not at a certain age, or, you know, you can change it even when you're young. So those aspects, and wanting to change the lives of my parents and my siblings, and, you know, basically impact the people who live around us, just made me want to do more. So that's why I started my company, and, you know, I started an organization. I co-founded an organization to just change this as well, you know, to change the situation of where we lived. So that's the reason why.
You say employment is quite limiting when it comes to creating your own wealth. Why do you say that?
I think when you're an entrepreneur, you drive the vision for your company, and you're very, very flexible in the sense that you can take risks, and there's no, you know, sort of like bureaucracy in you making decisions. So if you want to contact this particular client and, you know, close this deal, it's fast. And I feel like when you're an entrepreneur and you're solving all these problems, and you can do it from wherever you are, it's flexible. It's not limiting in the sense that, you know, there's a boss you have to ask, should you go this direction, and it can even be rejected. So you can drive the vision. If it's your company, you can take it anywhere, you know, anywhere you want. Like I can take my company to wherever I want, whichever country it is, and still be able to impact the lives of people around the world. So yeah, I believe entrepreneurship, it's a very, very important wealth creator. Yes.
Do you have any advice for your fellow entrepreneurs who are also trying to start up a business for themselves? Yes,
entrepreneurship is not easy. You know, we all see the glam and we think, wow, I want to do that. But then it gets, that times that it gets so hard, and that just the simple fact that you can persevere makes it even more cooler. So as young people, you know, we usually want things to happen so fast. You know, want to start a business and the next day you're making $1 million or after a few months. But then you have to understand that as a young person, you have to understand that there's a journey and there's a process, and you're gonna get all these things. You know, you're gonna become successful. You're going to get the amount of revenue that you're aiming for. But as young entrepreneurs, I just advise us, because I'm young as well, to understand the process, and, you know, just don't give up. Do it. When you get a no, you know, it shouldn't limit you. Still continue doing it. You'll achieve it. You'll get whatever you want. So yeah, perseverance, very important in entrepreneurship.
Some sound advice there coming from June, but that's where we leave it for Youth Africa. Coming up after the break, however, a discussion on Africa's timber industry. Stay with us. Welcome back. There are about 100 million hectares of fast wood plantations across the world, with another 1 million hectares being added each year to satisfy increasing demand. Then there is the rampant illegal hardwood logging trade. Invitations were extended to numerous representatives of South Africa's timber industry to join our discussion, but all were declined. Joining us now to discuss Africa's timber trade is Kola Masha, the Managing Director of Babban Gona in Lagos. And in Australia, we have on Skype Geofrey Mwanjela, who is the coordinator of the Worldwide Fund for Nature for East Africa and Madagascar Forest Program. Thank you so much, gentlemen, for joining me for this very important discussion. Geofrey, let's begin with you. Given that your organization works quite closely with raising global awareness about the impacts of the illegal trade of wood, can you give us an idea of exactly what impact this has had on East Africa so far?
I would say, I think, first, I think let's probably start in a way in terms of, I think the challenges related to timber trade across Eastern Africa and Madagascar are mostly driven by the growing demand in China, but also the increasing population of the middle class, particularly within the East African region. So countries like Kenya or Tanzania, where you have demand of more than 50% to what actually the country itself can supply domestically. Now, the challenge is that this is actually driving illegal wood of timber flowing into these countries from countries like DRC or Central Africa, undermining particular national economies, but also the economies of those local communities actually living close to the forest areas. And I think across East Southern Africa that many countries have been trying to make sure that local communities do benefit from these resources. Now, the question of having this illegal harvest of trade flowing into Eastern African countries is actually limiting benefits to the local communities, but also the national economies.
Because, Kola, as many are aware, I mean, billions of revenue are lost by economies because of this illicit trade practice. But my question to you is, does this speak to the inefficiencies in the formal market? And why is it so easy for this illicit trade of timber wood to continue rising at the rampant pace that it is?
fundamentally, at least in our region where we operate, one of the key challenges you have is the inability of government to be able to monitor and police these vast areas that we're talking about. Nigeria alone is over 900,000 square kilometers of land, and if you look at where a lot of this illegal forestry work happens, these are vast regions. And I think the government struggles to have the resources to be able to provide the requisite oversight.
Because as research from the UN actually shows, in some cases the trade of illegal timber can be more lucrative than trading drugs on the streets. But my question to you is, Geoffrey, you did mention China. Where is all this illegal timber finding a home? What are the uses?
For China, it's mostly for furniture companies, but also for, furniture production, but also construction industry, which is, I think, it's a large industry. But also that's the same within Africa itself, where you find actually a number of, large volumes of timber actually are purchased by government themselves through the procurement regulations and procurement policies that governments have. The challenge is that not a single government, possibly with the exception of South Africa, where you have clear guidelines on where a government could actually supposed to source timber from. And in particular, as I say, this is mostly for construction, but also furniture companies.
But I mean, if we know this, and I imagine that governments have been aware of the problem of this industry for some time now, have they not had enough time themselves to confront their own challenges to ensure that this is put to an end? Kola?
Well, I think there are steps that are being taken. I think if you look at in Nigeria, for example, what you've seen is the government trying to put controls on the exportation of unprocessed woods to try to create a limit to the exploitation of these markets. However, I think the challenge there is now in enforcing some of these new rules.
What about the signing of the Zanzibar Declaration on Illegal Trade in Timber and Other Forest Products, that document being signed in South Africa with the aims of solving this problem? What impact has this had in addressing the challenge of the illegal trade of timber?
So I guess I think what we've been seeing so far, particularly, I would just give an example for Southern Africa. Way back in 2002, there's what they call SADC Forest Protocol, which brings together about 15 member states that are falling within SADC. And the idea is that these countries are actually coming together to formulate regional actions where they would target this kind of thing. So illegal trade in timber. The challenge, I think, what we're having even after the Zanzibar Declaration has been signed is that timber trade is not given in same weight as it is in terms of the wildlife crime. And I think this is where the challenge is, because you have regulations that are falling internationally, and CITES, which actually regulates on species that are are not probably found anywhere else, particularly in some countries. But the challenge is that countries do invest a lot on wildlife and less on forestry. And we find that even these agreements that have been signed, governments do allocate actually less amount of money to make sure that those agreements are actually implemented. And then depending mostly on donor funding, so be it from WWF or Traffic or other international organization to support implementation of the action plans. And I think that's one of the challenges. So from WWF perspective, and our partners, we've been trying a lot since actually signing in 2015 to make sure that governments have action plans, but also to make sure that they actually implement those action plans. The challenge is that those actions are not implemented to the extent that actually they can actually address the illegality of timber across the region.
And Geoffrey, I'd just like to get more insights from you in just a moment about the exact actions that you put forward that governments can actually put in place to stop this trade from happening. But Kola, your view on the impact of agreements to help police the illegal trade of timber, such as that of the Zanzibar Declaration, I mean, the impact so far from where you're sitting?
We haven't seen a significant change. I think it comes down to the enforceability that I talked about earlier. But I think one of the key things, going on to your second key question, is around what is it that governments can do to try to actually mitigate for this. I think fundamentally, reality is you have today a situation very akin to what we saw in the ocean fisheries sector, where you have a scenario where there are very limited costs in producing this product, so you literally just have to go out and harvest it. And then you're going to get a situation similar to what you had in the oceans, where basically you're going to just get stocks depleted and depleted further. For example, in Nigeria today, you've got a situation where we are seeing some of the highest deforestation rates compared to many other parts of the world. I think the key steps that need to happen is you've got a scenario where you have to be able to incentivize good actors to come into this sector. And by doing that, those good actors will be following some of the critical steps that we believe will lead to sustainable forestry. You know, steps such as ensuring that when you don't clear cut forests, or you ensure that you don't take out every single type of a particular variety from that forest so that you cannot naturally replenish itself. How you can create a value chain for the production and distribution of seedlings to replace some of the trees that have been taken out. How you can tackle some of the key areas where you have already today clear-cut regions that you can now implement a tree plantation. And finally, I think it's very critical that government really start to enforce some of these regions that they've identified that should be reserves to maintain biodiversity within the country.
And Geofrey, step in here, if you will please. Some of the action plans that the WWF has put on the table of governments in the region to combat the trade of illicit timber.
So basically, I think what we're trying to do. So I'll just probably cite one example, is that a country like Madagascar, which has lost probably more than $5 million between just 2009 and 2015 of timber that has actually been seized either in Tanzania, Kenya, Mozambique, Sri Lanka, or Singapore. That is actually, we're talking about timber that has been seized that as it was on its way to China. So the idea was one of the action plans that we've been putting forward, and through SADC, is around how countries should come together to manage the stockpiles of timber that have been seized. And in particular, because countries have regulations and policies that actually they would sell the stockpiles based on what they see is the best option, but not necessarily to actually look at where this timber is coming from and what does this mean to another country that actually has lost its forest. So that's one of the mechanisms we're trying to push across the region. And on another front that we're trying to push is to say how, if we look at Southeast Asia, which is actually one of the major importers of timber coming from Southern Africa, it's a question of how do we generate a mechanism where we can put pressure on importing countries in Southeast Asia to make sure that customs authorities, but also forest authorities, can actually look back and say, where this timber is coming from, we have to make sure that it's actually legal, but also it's coming from sustainable forest. And I think one of the recent development is that Mozambique has signed, for example, an agreement with China, and we hope with this agreement more will probably happen. And in particular, is to show an example to other SADC member states to say that I think there's a light at the end of the tunnel. That other countries should follow, particularly some countries like Zambia or DRC, where there's a lot of timber that is going to China. Over.
Gentlemen, I imagine the points that you raise are not entirely new within your realms of groupings. You've discussed this before, even with the key agents that are the decision makers here. But how, going forward, how important is collaboration, particularly across regions, between the custom authorities of forests? How important is collaboration in dealing with this problem? Kola, if we begin with you, and then Geofrey, you can take it.
Collaboration is very critical because I think it's important that if the key exporting countries can work with the key importing countries to ensure that that they only import certified products that have come from certified sustainable sources, I think that would be a critical first step.
I think collaboration is most importantly for making sure that institutions more than just the ones dealing with forests have actually also come on board. And as mentioned, so we have forest authorities, we have custom agencies, we have police, we have intelligence, because we have to realize that illegality in timber it's an international crime, and it has to come at the realization of organizations such as Interpol to make sure that they also come on board. So they shouldn't look at only wildlife crime as one of the serious crimes internationally. So the question is, how can countries come together, share intelligence, share information of the consignments that are actually crossing over the country, and as mentioned by Kola, in terms of how to make sure that that timber coming from your side is sustainable. So what sort of documentation is actually required for an importing country to make sure that this is we can actually engage private sector and that facilitate the private sector to actually participate in the sustainable and legal trade of timber.
Gentlemen, we have run out of time, but surely this is a conversation that will continue, as the issue of conserving our forests is particularly important to combating things like climate change and ensuring that our wildlife have a home. Thank you so much once again to our guests, and just a reminder that invitations were extended to representatives here in South Africa to add to the conversation, but they declined. Before we go, we'd like to wish India a very happy 72nd birthday since the birth of its independence. Always remember, India is good business for South Africa. Even though most exports go to the United Kingdom and China, 5.1% of South Africa's exports go to India. And on that note, that is all for today's episode of Capital Connection. Join us again on Monday and Wednesday at the same time, 6:30 p.m. Central African Time. It's good night.